after the event. Good afternoon. I hope that everyone is doing well, and thank you for taking the time to join our webinar. I want to clarify a few items as we begin. You will be able to ask questions in the chat function throughout this session at any time by clicking on the question mark chat icon at the top of your screen. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Lastly, please note that the PDF version of this presentation will be sent to you after the event. Please take a moment to review our legal disclaimer. Okay, a little bit about NTech Polymers. We are a leading resin distributor that is based in Orlando, Florida. Our company was founded in 1985, and we have grown our business to be a top resin distributor in North America. About 30% of our business comes from the automotive sector. NTech Polymers is part of the Ravago family of companies and is the largest distribution unit under the Ravago umbrella. Ravago is a privately owned company that specializes in resin distribution, compounding and recycling, chemical distribution, and commodity trading. Ravago overall has a strong global presence in automotive, and we support a wide variety of automotive OEMs and Tier 1s across the globe. The host for today's events from NTech Polymers is myself, Eric Perel, and my colleagues Alex Lucitis and Ben Juarez. I am based in Michigan along with Alex, and we are 20-year veterans of the automotive industry. Ben Juarez is based in California and is new to the automotive team. Ben is concentrating specifically on the automotive EV market. Our group's focus is application and business development throughout the entire automotive value chain. With us today is Mike Wall from S&P Global Mobility, formerly known as IHS, and he is the presenter for this event. Mike serves as the Executive Director of Automotive Analysis at S&P Global Mobility. He brings to us over 25 years of financial analysis, consulting, and manufacturing experience. His primary focus is assisting manufacturers and financial firms in their evaluation and understanding of the automotive industry. He also specializes in the in-depth analysis of vehicle markets and trends. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Mike.
All right, thanks so much, Eric, and I really appreciate the opportunity to present once again kind of our latest outlook and where we see the market going. Suffice it to say, a lot going on. Just when we think we've kind of turned a corner, we see a new quarter or a new curve in front of us. But let's start the conversation around where we see the broader economy going, how we forecast, and I probably mentioned this before, we have a forecast that looks at things both top down and bottom up. That top down really starts with the economic outlook, some of the other drivers, economic drivers or other related drivers that influence and impact consumer demand, industrial production, economic development in general. Then we build up model by model, plant by plant in the case of production, model by model, country by country in the case of sales. So here we start taking a look at from a GDP perspective, economic growth perspective, and this is where things are still quite volatile. You know, obviously we went through the initial COVID impacts back in 2020. We went through a fairly deep but quick recession, kind of the quickest recession on record, 2 months, I believe, at the end of the day. And yet, but still quite impactful, quite deep. And yet consumer demand was only really waylaid for a couple months there. One of the interesting things during this downturn versus maybe prior downturns is the consumer has been pretty engaged in the auto industry, wanting to buy a vehicle. And now we've transitioned looking to this year and even last year. We've had semiconductor challenges, we've had other supply chain challenges that are really impacting us now from an economic perspective. Last year was a big year in terms of the recovery. Now, a fair amount of that was stimulus based, to be sure, and now we're coming off from that. And that was expected. We knew we were going to have a bit of a payback from the stimulus side, but then we had Russia-Ukraine really kick off near the end of February, and that has taken hold now. We're looking at global growth about 3.2%. Our U.S. growth just below that for this year. And in fact, we've just updated our forecast today. Our U.S. GDP forecast probably going to come in closer to 3% this year, and we're mindful of the fact that there are increasing risks of a potential recession. It's not in our base case scenario. We can talk about contingencies and scenarios to be sure, but by the same token, risks are increasing. We do expect interest rates to go up. Obviously, we've got inflation out there as well. That's having implications and influencing the market as well. And we'll touch on some of those other broader dynamics. Now, from a sales perspective, we take a look at global light vehicle sales here. And again, 2020, boy, a year we want to forget. We vented about 13 million units of sales that did not materialize relative to 2019, which was already kind of a contraction year back in 2019. The biggest thing that we've noticed, over the last 2 years is the snapback has not been as snappy as if you will. And interestingly, again, it's not so much demand. To be sure, certain markets are still not progressing all that as well from a demand perspective. But if you look at the US and even China to some extent, it's more production related or lack thereof than it is demand. And again, we'll touch on some of those dynamics, what's informing that. But rest assured, when we think about the outlook for the industry, even looking at this year, fairly low growth this year, about 81 million units global light vehicle sales, only about 1 million units incremental. And again, we're still wrestling with and dealing with the supply chain challenges really that are racking the global industry writ large, not even just any one particular market. And then you layer on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which are really impacting, to be sure, European demand and also production. Intermediate to longer term, we do expect the market to approach 100 million units towards the tail end of the forecast horizon. It's really going to need to come from those emerging markets, which are volatile in nature. So that certainly is a journey that we're going to be on, but it is one that it does have the potential for some additional volatility. Touching on global production here, you can see again 2020. I would argue 2020 was arguably more profoundly impacting production than even sales. And again, I alluded to the sales kind of hanging in there, demand, but yet production, we shut the world down for a good 7-8 weeks, and then that reboot process was slow. And then you flash forward to 2021. 2021 was so much focused on supply chain challenges, semiconductor, other components as well, and we're still navigating that in 2022. And then overlaying what's going on in Russia and Ukraine in terms of the direct impact to Russia sales and also the ancillary impact of production in the broader European market. This is something that the industry is still going to have to navigate, and that has some broader implications as well. And in fact, those broader implications are really kind of addressed in this slide. This is where I've taken a look at what changed the magnitude of our forecast revision in our March forecast versus February, and what are the drivers of that. And again, so much of this is really focused on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. You look at 2022, that dark blue, that's all direct loss of Russia production in particular. Ukraine produces a little bit on the vehicle side, not much. It's mainly components, which is a different problem. But you've got the immediate impact directly to Russia production and demand. And that's anywhere around 800,000 to 900,000 units in its own right. You can see that kind of cascades forward because we see this engagement lasting a while. Even if some of the hostilities cease, or even if the invasion is, call it, thwarted or ends, or we get a quote unquote peace, we still feel those Russian sanctions are still going to be largely in place. Now, to the extent they're not, that can create a different scenario, but this is sort of our base case on that front. The red or burgundy part of the bar there are supply chain losses. Now, a big chunk of that is Europe related as it relates to semiconductors, wire harnesses produced in the Ukraine, which have been knocked offline largely. And that's anywhere that could be in the neighborhood between both the wire harness and, again, ongoing semiconductor production as it relates to Europe, close to 900,000 to 1 million units unto itself. And then there's some additional semiconductor challenges in other markets as well. Now, we do expect to see those supply chain losses start to trim next year, but then you get the gold part of the slide, and that's that demand destruction. This is a global number, again, bear in mind. But when we see slower economic growth, higher inflation, higher interest rates, and the global impacts of that are really going to impact some of that demand globally. And again, this isn't any particular market, but certainly Europe is one that we would focus in on. In the US, to some extent, we'll touch on that in a moment, certainly vulnerable to that. It's definitely a global slide when we talk about some of those broader implications going forward. So it really does kind of impact some of that growth trajectory as we get out into the middle part of the decade, middle to later part of the decade. This slide, one of the things we've been tracking, well, for the last year or better, has been the impact to vehicle production of the semiconductor shortages. The bar charts there are sort of weekly volume unit impacts. And you can see, especially, and this is a global number again, when you see that late second quarter, early third quarter timeframe, boy, those production impacts were significant. We really saw some spikes there, and it was really related to, again, chip availability, not just on the front end, the wafer construction, but really on the assembly, testing, and packaging side due to COVID lockdowns in Malaysia, some of the other areas that are really reliant or responsible for that activity. One key takeaway here, though, is as you go forward, more recently, they're certainly not as heavy. The disruption is not as heavy, we're not seeing as much outward significant plant level disruption, but we are still seeing that plant throughput is still below pre-COVID levels. It's still a little anemic, so we still have some work to do there. And then this impact does not cover, certainly doesn't factor in the COVID-19 containment losses that we're seeing in China even right now. The Russia-Ukraine impacts I alluded to earlier, particularly some of those that are semiconductor related or even the ones that are wire harness related, and then weather and other power outages. So there are, again, a lot of curves we're having to navigate in this industry. But again, from a direct plant level disruption perspective, in terms of actual downtime, we have seen some improvement on that front. So we can certainly take that to heart. That's helpful on that end. Now let's talk a little bit about semiconductors. I'm not the semiconductor analyst myself within our firm. We have a number of them, and I've been working closely with them. But I wanted to give everybody kind of the latest lay of the land of what we see going on with semiconductors. This is informed by our broader team that are talking to the semiconductor manufacturers, talking to tier ones, tier twos, and the automakers alike. There are really four key areas of concern, if you will. First and foremost, number of chips per car. Significant. The chip per car activity has grown significantly. Even since 2017, we've doubled the number of chips per vehicle. So as you can imagine, the demand for those chips have been off the charts. So that's an issue we're having to navigate. Right next to that, if we go clockwise around here, mismatch of production and demand, sort of that dubbed toilet paper effect. Boy, that's a challenge in and of itself. We've got automakers and suppliers, their expectations of what they believe they need for chips are not matched up with what the chip manufacturers are either able to produce or willing to produce, frankly, because the chip manufacturers are getting some mixed messages. They're being told, we want you to produce everything you can produce, but yet there's a law of diminishing returns there. There will be a point where the automakers and the suppliers won't need all of those chips, and the chip manufacturers are loath to create an inventory bubble. Then you go down to let's go down to the lower left corner, diagonal, total capacity for chip fabrication. This is a big one. When we talk about semiconductors, a lot of times it's easy to get caught up in this circular loop of this ubiquitous term of semiconductors, and they really are more complex than that. You've got analog chips, which are the older technology chips, and we use a lot of those in the auto industry. And then we've got some more advanced microcontrollers and advanced process node chips as well. The investment right now going on, the vast majority of the investment, 88% or so, is going towards those advanced chips, which kind of makes sense given that's the way the industry is evolving towards, and even non-automotive applications. The problem is that 12%, only 12% is going to analog chips, and we use a lot of analog chips still in autos. So we've got the potential for some tightness in analog chip supply. We have to keep our eye on that. And then finally, allocation of chip fabrication capacity automotive. That's going to be a never-ending battle. That's us in the auto industry having to do battle, if you will, with consumer electronics. We're vying, there's a demand battle there, or also industrial production and industrial manufacturing and other categories as well. So it's an ongoing process that really we're going to have to navigate. Now let's touch on a couple international markets before we get into a little deeper dive into North America and the US. So China, I alluded to this earlier, we have seen those China lockdowns really start to increase. And in fact, we've got for 2022, we very much only flat production growth. We've got a little bit of production growth here, but we did just a few hours ago release our latest forecast, where we do expect China to decline just a little bit, still effectively about flattish production. But again, it's that impact when we take down Shanghai, the Shenzhen region, and Shenzhou, Shenzhen and Shenzhen, both of those markets in, again, broader Shanghai is having some very significant impacts to vehicle production, component production, and it's going to be some time before we are able to kind of, again, reboot that system. We're starting to see some plants coming back online. So again, I don't want to cast too grave of a shadow. Automakers are trying to create sort of an ecosystem within their plants, and that's great. The challenge there is that to the extent that maybe a downstream supplier isn't able to create that same ecosystem, the supply chain is still vulnerable. So we have to keep our eyes on that. But the broader demand side of the equation in China has still been fairly healthy. We've seen some recovery there, but again, we need to be able to produce the vehicles in order to satisfy that demand. Now, Europe is a little bit of a different case altogether. This particular slide looks at Europe production excluding Russia and those other CIS countries. So important to make that note. We're kind of removing Russia from the equation here. We know that there's some really bad expectations there, down 54% this year versus last, as an example. Let's look at sort of Europe excluding those countries. Now, here you see growth of about 13% in 2022. The caveat there, so one, it's off of a very weak base. And in fact, we have made with the forecast revision a couple hours ago. Again, we have taken a few 100,000 units off of that number as well. Still growth, again, because we got a very low base, but we're also mindful of the fact that it's still a pretty treacherous environment. When you think about, again, wire harnesses coming out of the Ukraine, that's impacting broader European production, especially for some of the German automakers. They're trying to resource those or source those to other plants, working with the tier ones in this case, but it takes time. And then we have something else that we're watching very closely because of the situation with Russia, Ukraine, because of the inflation that's being created, whether you look at natural gas, oil, and just regular gasoline prices. All of these have the potential to create sort of a macro overhang that's going to have the potential to impact demand even in Western Europe as you look out to the intermediate to longer term. So watch this space. We're still seeing some risk as it relates to the broader European market. And again, so much of this is in some ways anchored to or tethered to the Russia-Ukraine situation that remains ongoing. Now let's talk about the US market, talk about North America a little bit and dig into that, because that's where I think we see some really interesting trends going on. On this slide, what I did is I took a look at our January 2020 forecast. That's the dashed line you see there, and tried to kind of represent or create a scenario around what the market looked like before COVID, what our expectations for the market were like pre-COVID, and then our latest sales forecast for March here. And you can see there's a gap, obviously. We've gone through a lot these last 2+ years, and the reality certainly did not resemble what we were expecting in January of 2020. So then that begs the question, what does pent-up demand look like? Because in a normal contraction, in a normal recession, as an example, and this isn't arguably, it was not all that normal, but that pent-up, that lost demand isn't fully lost necessarily. It does create the opportunity to recover some of that demand. And that's what we have baked into the forecast here. Now you'll notice the blue area above the dashed line does not equal the red area below the dashed line. And some of that is demand destruction. And frankly, I think there is the potential to outpace that blue area. There's some upside potential to be sure, but again, that's more of an optimistic scenario in our estimation right now, because we are looking at some demand destruction starting to creep up here as we see, again, inflation running higher for longer, as we see interest rates really start to run up. Vehicle pricing obviously being impacted by those inflationary pressures as well. The consumer themselves are still engaged in wanting to buy a vehicle, but they're starting to be battered by some of those external factors. And that's something that's giving us at least a little bit of pause. Now, the good news is we're still in that 16.5 million units, maybe even 17 million unit range as you start thinking about vehicle demand. Still very positive. But the longer this goes on, the more vulnerable that pent-up demand really becomes, the ability to outperform and overshoot that. Here we take a look at inventory. And again, this is somewhat obvious because all we have to do is go to our local dealership and see just the dearth of new vehicles out there. But I thought it does stand in stark contrast, and it's illustrative of really what we're having to navigate. You can see here, the area chart is the gray, and that's inventory out on dealer lots. You can see it was not uncommon for us to have 3.5, 4 million units of vehicles out there. Flash forward to now, we're lucky to have 1 million. In fact, last month we just crept above 1 million units on dealer lots. Now, question I'm getting a lot is, what will normal look like coming out of this? Will we get back to normal on inventory? And I think the short answer is, well, one answer is it depends, but my first answer is I think there will be a bit of a new normal. I don't think the industry is going to need that 3.5 to 4 million units anymore. I think automakers and their dealers alike have seen the value of a leaner inventory structure. We definitely need more than 1 million units, hands down. But I do think when we talk about inventory days on hand, it was, an average inventory days on hand, or a healthy inventory days on hand, was oftentimes thrown out there about 60 days, maybe 66 days. And the industry would invariably, as a whole, oftentimes push that up to 80 days, 90 days. For pickup trucks, as an example, it wasn't uncommon to be triple digits. I do think we're going to see a little bit more rationalization on that front. I could see the industry shifting into the low 50-day range. In fact, some automakers perhaps even getting into 40 days as they see the benefits of having a more optimized inventory structure. And frankly, a better, more efficient build order strategy, and the ability to maybe even optimize the trim level packages and things like that, so that you can have still a fair amount of product on the lot, but you don't have to have inordinate levels of product to have to be able to cover all those range of trim levels and creature and feature content as well. So it'll be something to watch. It'll be interesting to see how it kind of plays out as production does start to recover. And that really dovetails nicely into this slide. Here we take a look at our latest North American light vehicle production forecast. And boy, and I work with a lot of suppliers, talk to a lot of suppliers, and I know how impactful this has been. The last 2 years have been just devastating, to say the least. And really, that's really what we've been navigating at 13 million units the last 2 years. We've needed some relief. Now this year, we do expect to get some relief. We're at 14.7, but we have had to reduce that in the past. Now, interestingly enough, this is our latest March settings, but we did, was our latest until about a couple hours ago. We did release our April settings. I'll let you know too, though, we did not make a significant reduction. We added maybe 9,000 units to 2022. So I think that's a victory in the one sense. We saw some stability in production in North America for this year. And it's important to point out, there's some things that we're keeping an eye on. We're watching palladium coming out of Russia, because palladium goes into the catalysts that go into catalytic converters. We have to keep that in mind, or be mindful of that. And then also these COVID lockdowns in China, to the extent that there might be some component impacts to us in North America. It's a little tough to determine explicitly. There's not as much, it doesn't appear directly coming on to North America via China from these lockdowns, but there's some vulnerability there. We're going to want to keep our eyes on that as well, at least in the extreme near term. Good news is that recent production results coming out of March have actually been holding up reasonably well. We've been actually fairly pleased about that. You look to next year, we're at 16.7. We did trim that just a little. I think we're about 16.5 for next year with our latest forecast settings. So again, healthy number though. A lot of this is going to be driven by supply chain events and efforts to really reestablish kind of a more steady cadence of component supply on that front. Here we take a look at North American production by country, and there's some great takeaways here. I'll tell you, when you look at between 2019 and 2029, we're looking at about 1.2 million units of production growth in the U.S. That's huge. We're seeing some new capacity coming online. We're seeing certainly some new battery electric vehicle capacity coming online as well. I mean, it is stunning to see the amount of activity on that front. So definitely some strong growth in the U.S., seeing more localization. That's another question I'll get from time to time. You know, with everything going on internationally, whether it be, acts of God like weather events or earthquakes, or even, geopolitical threats, do we see more regionalization or globalization? I think it's fair to say we see much more opportunity for additional regionalization, more regional supply chains, and even regional localized production. And I think that certainly is borne out in our forecast as well. We see, as you look at Mexico's about flat. We do it down about 156,000 units. I think there's some upside there. In Canada, obviously sticks out a little bit like a sore thumb, down about 700,000 units between 2019 and 2029. A caveat there, though, is Canada is making some big investments in EVs. So as those start to possibly take hold, there's some opportunity there in their own right to possibly see some outperformance on the Canada side, the Canadian production front. So again, keep an eye on that to be sure. Here we take a look at North American production by automaker type, and some interesting trends start to emerge here. I may have mentioned this in the past, but I think it's instructive to look at 2019 in one sense. We had parity between the Detroit 3 and the transplants. Never happened in the past. It was always a Detroit 3, the old days of Big 3 environment. That's changed. So that parity has shifted. Now we've shifted from majority Detroit 3 to majority transplant, and it won't go back the other way. We're not expecting it to. And the interesting thing is when you look at the Detroit 3, though, that's 7.5, 7.7 or 8 million units. That should be very profitable production, though. We've gotten rid of a lot of the underperforming segments, the underperforming vehicles and programs, and they're left with light truck programs, increasingly battery electric vehicles as well. You've got the transplants, the traditional transplants, the Hondas, Toyotas, BMWs, Mercedes of the world, localizing production here and bringing on battery electric vehicles. And then you've got the blue there is the new startups. The burgeoning startups, including Tesla. Right now it's largely Tesla, but also Rivian and the like. And obviously that's on everybody's radar as well. So we've got new opportunities coming with new localization with the transplants, a lot of redesigns for the Detroit 3, and also some new battery electric vehicle launches. And then there's the startup activity. And I have not included Tesla on this particular slide because they frankly break the X. They break the scale because they're off the charts. Well, I wanted to show some of the other new startups, or really the new startups, at least a sampling of them. It's not an exhaustive list because there are frankly some new startups that we kind of haven't quite considered ready for prime time quite yet, for at least an inclusion in our forecast. But it's a pretty diverse list, basically going from A to Z, Arrival to Zoox in this case. And you can see obviously Rivian is there. Front and center, we're seeing some pretty decent growth in the intermediate term in particular. It's been a little slowish to start, and they certainly would be. They certainly admit to that as well, and it's not surprising given some of the supply chain challenges out there. But as they navigate that, got a long list of hand raisers and reservation holders for Rivian. And we do expect there to be some pretty good growth prospects. Again, not just for their traditional products being pickup truck and sport utility vehicle, but also for the Amazon van and other new products that they're working on. Then you look at some of the other players. Lucid Motors certainly jumps out at you. They're following more of the Tesla model, if you will. Sedans to start, very high priced, very well executed, I would say though too. So very strong amount of miles, range, if you will, on the battery, well contented and high performance. And then other automakers too. It very much differs based on their execution strategy. You got Arrival that's looking at micro factories, low volume micro factories, and more of a commercial focus. Zoox, which is really looking at more just autonomous vehicles for the most part. And then, Fisker and Canoo, again, coming in with their own bespoke applications as well. Fisker's an interesting one to watch with Foxconn and now Magna as well. was a bit more of a mainstream product offering. So certainly there are ones to watch. VinFast isn't on here, but we are adding them to the forecast this month. You may have seen them in any of the news coming out of the New York Auto Show. More recently, they announced a new plant in North Carolina. So some new incremental capacity coming on with a new startup. It's going to be an interesting one though, because they got an interesting business model, leasing a battery. So there's an education process to go through with consumers as well. So certainly watch that space. The latest production launch activity, and for suppliers that are on the line, boy, I tell you, if you're a tool and die manufacturer, you're busy because we've got a lot of new products that are coming down the pike. If you're a production part manufacturer, you're going to start seeing that RFQ cadence really start to pick up. Again, don't have a lot of launches, not nearly as many launches this year, about 23 launches. These should be all newer majors. These do include battery electric vehicles, internal combustion vehicles. It doesn't distinguish between the two. But the last couple of years have been a little bit overly depressed because of COVID, because of supply chain challenges. It's starting to inflect. It's starting to inflect upwards, especially next year. We've got next year and the following year well north of 30 launches, and then 2025 and 2026 north of 40 launches. So we're going to have a pretty active launch cadence these next really 4 to 5 years, even if you carry it out to 2027. Again, this year is a little bit more depressed, but the launches are coming. So whether, again, you're working on more on the tooling side or the equipment investment side, or if you're working on the production part side, a lot of new product is coming down the pike. And that brings us to this next slide, because with that new product brings opportunity and risk. Here, I'm just looking at battery electric vehicles. So the left-hand side of the slide are battery electric vehicles in North America, model count. So for each year, just the hard count of the number of models that are battery electric, not launches per se, but these are just a count of the models produced in North America for each year in bar form, in the bar chart form. And then the line is the actual volume of those battery electric vehicles. And you can see we're about to go supersonic, if you will, on model count. This year, we're at about 27 models that are battery electric produced in North America. By 2027, we're going to be at 122. By 2030, we're going to be at 144. Huge opportunity for new models that are launching, to be sure. But the right-hand side of the slide also tells a story about maybe some of the risk. Your average battery electric vehicle production is about 85 to 90,000 units per nameplate. Think of it in terms of volume per nameplate. Flash over to battery electric vehicle production volume per nameplate. And when you look at 2019, we were at close to 60,000 units. But boy, that wasn't a lot of models. It was mostly Tesla, frankly, that were really driving that volume. As we go forward, as we start launching these additional raft of new battery electric vehicles, we're going to have this kind of mushy middle where volume is going to be kind of in this 35,000 units per nameplate. So again, for suppliers that are used to producing hundreds of thousands of parts a year for a program or maybe even a platform, that's going to come under pressure. So we're maybe for a period of time, at least, we're redefining the term high volume manufacturing. So flexibility is going to be key. Flexibility in your manufacturing process, tool changes on the line, flexibility within the line itself, the assembly line, the ability to do that. Now volume per nameplate does start to go up towards the tail end of our forecast horizon and beyond, as we do get to, we're projecting nearly 6 million units of production battery electric by 2030. But again, that we have to catch up to that model count to be able to really kind of, hopefully drive some additional efficiencies and economies of scale. Why are we projecting kind of where we are in terms of that growth in EV adoption and EV production? Well, this slide, I think, tells an interesting story. You look at the West Coast there, California, Oregon, now Washington more recently, and then the East Coast, especially the Northeast, those green areas. Those are what's called the CARB states, California Air Resources Board, originated out of California, of course. These are states that are pushing for a much higher zero emission vehicle penetration in the future. In fact, here recently, I think last week, California announced they're looking at 70% battery electric or 70% zero emission vehicle by 2030 and 100% by 2035. Washington, I think, is pushing to go 100% by 2030. These have some huge implications because when you add up all those CARB states, you get to about 32 to 33% of US registrations. So it's a very significant amount of demand potentially. Now, there are more than just those CARB states. Obviously, we've got a lot of middle America through here, a lot of big states too, Texas and Florida, certainly sizable states in their own right. And they'll have different adoption curves as well. And we have different implications. We've got charging infrastructure to build out, battery efficiency, range, again, range anxiety to battle that, education in general. But those are some of the drivers too that we're thinking about, particularly as it relates to these states really starting to set some much more significant goals and targets around zero emission vehicles. That takes us into this next slide where we take a look at how does this, not just zero emission vehicle or battery electric, but frankly, all of the different powertrain technologies, how do they evolve over time? And here I've overlaid North America, Europe, and Greater China. And starting with North America, obviously that's probably near and dear to many on this call. Last year, or not last year, 2020, we were at 3% battery electric, and that's that brown category there. By 2025, we do see that growing to 16%. And then 2030, we're at 35%. Now, there's some things that are helping to influence that. We've got here recently the CAFE requirements, that CAFE announcement by the Biden administration targeting 49 miles per gallon fleet-wide by model year 2026. Those are some big implications. We're entering sort of that mushy middle I was talking about, where you're still going to see bad internal combustion to be sure, but the growth is going to be varied, but also on the heels of just a lot more product on the battery electric side. By 2030, again, we're going to see some of those state-by-state targets really starting to take hold, and we're closer to 35%. Now, we can't even hold a candle to Europe right now. When we look at where we see Europe growth going, 2025, we're looking at 26% battery electric, and then by 2030, 62%. That's really informed by, you look at the Fit for 55 program that was announced in Europe. They're targeting a 55% reduction in CO2 by 2030 and 100% reduction by 2035. Well, that's zero emission at that point. That's battery electric or some derivation. And then Greater China is in the middle. Call that sort of somewhere in the middle. It's interesting because Greater China, we're looking at 46% by 2030. Greater China is a little different because you got those coastal markets, which are very much more developed, almost more like a mature market, and then those more internal provinces and regions within China that are still kind of emerging. So they're going to be under different paths. And again, part and parcel of really all three of these regions are both a carrot and stick approach. Carrot being incentives, whether it be incentives around charging infrastructure, incentives around selling these vehicles. And then there's the stick approach, which is regulatory, the regulatory and the penalties around that as well. So some of that is informing the forecast. Both sides are really helping to inform and shape the forecast going forward as well. With that, I'll wrap it up with just kind of a brief summary, and we'll get into some Q&A. Again, it's almost cliche to say volatility is heightened. It certainly is. We're navigating, again, a lot of curves right now, and really the external events have been just so significant. I will say that the supply chain has proven to be very resilient. We've navigated a lot, but we've overcome a lot. Component shortages are still out there. Labor availability is still challenging, and we are starting to see supplier distress starting to pick up a bit more, if you will. But again, we've had to navigate quite a bit. Well, once we get through this current cycle, while we see growth rates maybe slowing somewhat, those core themes, electrification, safety, autonomous technologies, not so much autonomous vehicles right in our face, but autonomous technologies, and even those new mobility dynamics we do feel are going to play a significant role still. These last two bullets are really the name of the game I think this industry is going to be navigating, is scale and sort of consolidation, collaboration. Scale, trying to find any way to get scale. Again, if you've got to navigate all of these new models, how best can we leverage commonality amongst those models, leverage architectures to build those, retain and build on those economies of scale, and then consolidation and collaboration. Again, it doesn't mean everything's going to, M&A and come together in acquisitions and consolidation. We can see we're seeing collaboration. Frankly, we're seeing both. And again, the biggest wild card and I think this is a positive wild card for North America, U.S. increased localization of supply chains. I think it's becoming less of a wild card, frankly, and more of a more of a reality. So again, I think we're going to see more and more opportunities on the localization front. So again, stay tuned for that. And with that, I will turn it over to Alex for some moderated Q&A.
Super. Thanks so much. Great job there, Mike. Oh, unfortunately, I think I'm getting an echo, and let's hope that goes away. Yeah, I did. Super. So I've got a few questions here that have come up, Mike, and I'm just curious, who are some of the new EV producers that maybe we didn't mention or thinking about that not getting as much attention? I also noticed that Lordstown wasn't on there anymore, and I keep sort of hearing one way or another they're going to start producing, but they did sell their facility. So just maybe something you can enlighten us on there.
Yeah, you hit on one of them was is Lordstown. We had them in the forecast for a while there, but we did feel compelled to pull them out. It seems like every day there's a new EV manufacturer coming into the mix, which is kind of the challenge that we face. And we've got kind of this heuristic or rule of thumb that I say a rule of thumb that's probably more definitive than what it should be, but it's looking at the venture capital funding, or if it's a SPAC, access to capital, how far along are they in development, do they have a manufacturing site, and so forth. So yeah, Lordstown jumps out. There's Last Mile Solution, ELMS. That's another one that's out there as well. Trying to think, some of them are escaping me off the top of my head, but there are a number of new ones that kind of creep up almost by the day. I would also first and foremost say, for anybody who's kind of navigating that, I would encourage them to give me a call, give our team a call. And again, we don't turn a meter on, so don't worry about that. I would love to chat with you about it, because there are so many. Any forecast analyst is going to have a number of different things on a list, a running list of stuff going on that doesn't necessarily bubble up into the forecast at a given point in time. But those are a couple that jump right out. I know there's a multitude of others that are still out there and kind of that we're even evaluating for adding into the forecast in the future.
Okay, thank you. That sounds great. Just how frequently do you update the manufacturing forecast? Just curious if that's a monthly or quarterly.
No, great question. The production forecast, the light vehicle production forecast is updated monthly. We have a medium and heavy vehicle forecast is updated quarterly. And then our sales forecast is updated 8 times a year. But yeah, production forecasts that we're kind of known for on that end, light vehicle production is monthly.
Okay. And then we did have another one, like any other foreign producers like BYD or NIO. Do you see them coming to the U.S. and potentially sort of disrupting the overall domestic EV forecast for production and sales?
It's a great question. That has come up from time to time as well. It didn't even start just with battery electric. I remember, it's been over the last 5 to 10 years. There've been different Chinese manufacturers really kind of looking at coming up into the U.S. market, maybe through Mexico or directly into the U.S. market. I think there's the potential still. Don't get me wrong, and there are some you mentioned, BYD and NIO are great examples, Xpeng and another that have made some very significant strides on battery electric. So I do think there's that potential. We don't have anything baked in the forecast yet. I think part of it is, and I think, well, there's a couple fold. One, they're navigating kind of both the challenges and the opportunities within their home markets, and that's kind of been part and parcel of what those Chinese manufacturers have had to wrestle with, again, for the last 10 years plus, that have maybe delayed or deferred some of those intentions to come this way. Now it becomes even more interesting, because if Russia still becomes this sort of pariah state, for lack of a better term, do some of those Chinese manufacturers really look at targeting Russia manufacturing to fill in the gap, because most of Western manufacturers have left? So that may even draw some of that enthusiasm, if you will. The U.S. market is a very popular market, though, because of the richness of our mix and average transaction prices and that sort of thing. The other thing to watch really closely, though, is their go-to-market strategy. Should they want to come down this way? Because the challenge right now is you've got some battery electric vehicle manufacturer, Tesla, certainly Rivian, going kind of their own way from a dealership and distribution strategy. In fact, not having dealers in this case. But there certainly is a benefit to having some level dealer distribution, or again, service after the sale, that's with rooftops of a traditional dealer. I don't know that they necessarily go a traditional dealer route, but perhaps there's a a hybrid approach. Those are some of the other factors I think that they're going to have to navigate. We do have Geely with Volvo, so I mean, it's not, there are certainly some patterns and some templates that can be followed, to be sure.
Very interesting. And that kind of lends me into one other question I have related to the inventory and then the dealers themselves. You mentioned the lots are empty, right? It doesn't seem like there's a lot of new vehicles on those lots. So I guess I'm just curious, how in the world is the inventory still up near 1 million vehicles if there's nothing out there to buy?
Well, no, that's a fair point. So it is tough because I get into this myself. I'll go to my local dealers and they only have like 4 or 5 cars or what have you. There are a number of dealers. There's, gosh, I forget the latest count, in the thousands on the dealer side. So we got that. That's kind of at play. In that inventory total, there are some inventory in transit. So there is some level of, and I don't have that actual raw percentage, but there is certainly inventory in transit. And then there are markets that are heavier than others. And that's the big thing for me. I'm in Michigan, but more importantly, I'm in West Michigan. So my market is probably not as high on the totem pole, if you will, as like a Texas, if we're talking about pickup trucks and down in Texas, or California, some markets, California or Florida, if you will. It does vary based on market, and frankly, some dealers have been maybe better at navigating this. I've seen some dealers really kind of focusing on used vehicles. And used vehicles is fraught right now because pricing is so high and availability is not great. It's improved. So they're kind of balancing where they can. But yeah, I know it does look like still a large number, and 1 million is a big number, but it's divvied out amongst all those rooftops and then again, those vehicles that are in transit.
Okay. Well, super. We really appreciate your time and effort here and everything that you obviously answered and presented. On behalf of S&P Global Mobility and the Entech Polymers team, we'd like to thank everyone who attended. Anyone who wasn't able to attend or knows someone that wants to see it can go and visit the Entech Polymers website and watch it at their convenience. Any questions that may come up later from watching it, or if somebody just didn't want to send it yet, go ahead and feel free to reach out and contact one of us. All the information is listed there. And then obviously a special thanks to Mike, you and your team, as well as Heather Lotus Photo, who helped really organize and get this thing coordinated. That's it from all of us here at Entech. Have a great day and remainder of your week. Thanks so much, and goodbye.